What's going on, guys? This is Johnny Brook from Crafted Workshop, and in this week's video I want to show you 5 upgrades I've made to my assembly table and workbench that I think could come in handy in pretty much any shop environment. So let's rewind a bit and look at some of the issues I was having with my assembly table, which ended up driving me to make this video. So I built this table almost 7 years ago at this point, and it's been one of my core pieces of shop furniture over those years. That said, time has not been the kindest to the table, and it's seen 2 shop moves, which put some extra wear and tear on the table. After the most recent move to my shop, the table also got covered in mold, which thankfully has been neutralized, but still needs to be removed so the table doesn't look so gross. I decided to start the upgrades by making the assembly table more mobile, and I figured the easiest way to move this thing around would be to use my pallet jack. To accomplish this, I'd be adding some skids to the underside of the assembly table. First, though, I wanted to test out the new height of the table to make sure it wasn't going to be too tall for me.
Is this too high?
And the height actually seemed great. Feeling good about the height, I went ahead and moved forward by stripping the assembly table down to bare cabinets. I tossed the drawer slides, which had been bent and damaged during the move, which I'll replace later, and continued getting the table back to a blank canvas. One of my favorite features of this assembly table is the Systainer storage, but I had to configure these a little differently due to those workbench casters, and I'll be reinstalling these in a much more efficient layout now that those casters are gone. Speaking of which, I uninstalled the workbench caster mounting plates along with the leveling feet, which were actually causing one of the sides to split from all of the load being put on them. I got the rest of the hardware removed, and then I could turn my attention to the skids. I decided to make these out of a few pieces of 2x material glued together, and I went with 2x8s ripped in half since they're made out of southern yellow pine in this part of the country. And southern yellow pine is much stronger than SPF, or spruce pine fir, which your typical 2x4 is constructed from. I installed a ripping blade on my table saw, ripped the 3 2x8s in half, and then I could get them glued up. Before gluing, I added some builder's paper to my workbench, and it's a good thing I added the paper because, as usual, I added way too much glue, but otherwise the glue up went uneventfully. I left the glue to dry overnight, and the next day I removed the clamps, ditched the paper, and was left with a perfectly clean workbench. Next, I needed to get the skids cut and milled down to size, and I started by rough cutting them to length at the miter saw. I left an extra inch or 2 so I could square them up later, and then I moved to the jointer to square up one face and one edge. I think this is actually the first time I've used my jointer in the new shop, and I cannot describe how excited I am to be getting back to some woodworking projects. To square up the other face and edge, I could move to the planer, which brought them both parallel to the face and edge I had just squared up on the jointer. Finally, it was back to the miter saw to cut the skids to final length, and I also added a little angled notch to the ends, and this will allow me to get my pallet jack under the assembly table a little more easily since it opens up the approach angle. After all that milling, the edges were extremely sharp and fragile, so I added a small chamfer using my block plane, which is just so satisfying. With that, the skids were ready to be installed, and before screwing the cabinet to the skid, I got the skids centered and added a slight reveal between the cabinets and the skids. I used some 2.5-inch structural screws to attach the skids to the assembly table, and I added screws every 6 inches or so along the length of the skid. I also pre-drilled and countersunk the holes so the heads of the screws would be flush with the surface of the plywood. Once the skids were installed, I could test out lifting the assembly table with my pallet jack, and unfortunately, there was a problem. So as I mentioned earlier, there's an opening in the back of the cabinets, and as it turned out, the pallet jack had nothing to lift with on this side because of this open area. To solve this, I added a piece of 3/4-inch plywood, and before installing, I went ahead and got rid of some of that dead mold on the underside of the table. To make installing the new piece of plywood easier, I added another strip of plywood on the underside of the cabinets, which the new piece could sit on during installation. I installed the new plywood with more structural screws, pocket holes, and 1 1/4-inch screws into the strip I had added, and I think it's safe to say this thing is not going anywhere.
Alright, let's try this again.
Finally, with the new piece added, I could test the pallet jack again, and it worked exactly like I imagined. And I know it's a bit of a luxury, but if you have a larger shop space, I can't recommend a pallet jack enough. They are insanely handy for this kind of thing.
It is so choice. If you have the means, I highly recommend picking one up.
Next, I wanted to start on the facelift, and this would include painting the base of the assembly table. Before doing that, I vacuumed and sanded the entire base, removing that dead mold and prepping for paint. Once that was done, I could get to painting, and I started by applying a coat of this mold-killing primer. And this probably wasn't totally necessary, but it wasn't too much more expensive than standard primer, and should hopefully help to keep mold at bay in the future. After rolling on a coat of primer, I could get the paint applied, and I decided to try my hand at mixing my own signature color. TotalBoat sells this really cool custom color kit for their elixir paint, which I use on most of my furniture projects due to its durability.
So to start, we're going to do 8 ounces of blue, 8 ounces of yellow. Okay, so we've got kind of a turquoise, really. Definitely going to need a lot more yellow, I think.
Unfortunately, I didn't read the instructions close enough, and as it turned out, the blue was much stronger than the yellow, meaning I had to add a ton more yellow to get closer to the color I wanted.
Alright, we're going to get a bigger container here.
I kept adding yellow until I ran out, and I still wasn't at the color I wanted, so I added a little white for good measure just to lighten things up, and I ended up with a color I liked, but I'm pretty sure it was almost identical to the seafoam green color TotalBoat offers in their elixir paint, so it's not as custom as I had hoped for. I decided to try rolling on the paint, and I wasn't really liking the way it was looking.
This does not look very good.
So I went ahead and sprayed the paint on, which left me with a much nicer surface finish. And my spray booth isn't set up here at the new shop, which is why I avoided spraying in the first place, but I just set up some drop cloths and got to spraying, adding 2 coats in total. While the paint dried, I could get started on building some new drawers, and I decided to make a handful of these smaller drawers for screw storage. And I built these drawers out of scrap material and used 1/2-inch plywood for the sides and 1/4-inch plywood for the drawer bottoms. I assembled the drawers with glue and pin nails, and thankfully they went together pretty quickly. Before installing the new drawers, I needed to go ahead and clean up the old drawers, which included removing the slide hardware and drawer fronts, which I'll be rebuilding later in this video. After removing the slides, I went ahead and cleaned them up, starting with some WD-40, then following that up with some silicone lubricant, which made a huge difference in the performance of the drawers. I also decided to clean up some of the old drawers, since I guess I wasn't quite as accurate back in the day, and some of these drawer bottoms were overhanging the sides. I tried out this awesome new compression flush trim bit from Bits & Bits, and this bit features their new Astra HP coating. And I got the bit installed in my trim router and then got to flush trimming, which went really quickly and left me with a super smooth surface finish.
Feels really good.
I also went ahead and sanded the drawers, breaking all the sharp edges, which I hadn't done when I built this table originally. And there's nothing worse than banging a knuckle on a sharp drawer or cabinet edge, so this was definitely a must for me. After sanding all the old drawers and the new drawers I had just built, I could finally get the drawers reinstalled. And the easiest way I've found to do this is just to use spacers and mount the drawer slides and drawers from the bottom up. I started with the first set of drawer slides, adding a 1/4-inch spacer below the slides. I used a self-centering drill bit to make sure the slides didn't wander during installation. Once the slides were installed, I added the first drawer box, leaving the 1/4-inch spacer below the box, and I slid the drawer out enough so I could access the first mounting hole on the drawer slide. Next, I slid the drawer out a little further until I could get to the next set of holes and repeated the process. Finally, I repeated the process for the last holes, but alternatively, I could have removed the whole drawer and done this on the bench, since the placement of the slide was locked in with the first 2 screws.
It's a lot smoother, holy moly. That's silicone spray for the frickin' win, jeez.
From there, I could just rinse and repeat for the rest of the drawers, using 1/2-inch plywood as a spacer between the rest of the drawers. You also might notice that there's a gap between the top drawer and the underside of the top, and this is to allow for the overhang of the assembly table top. If the drawer was tight to the underside of the top, I wouldn't have been able to access the stuff in the very back of the drawer, even with the overextension slides I'm using. With the drawers installed, I could turn my attention to the drawer fronts, which I wanted to contrast the green color of the rest of the table. I dug around through some of the material that was left in the shop when I bought the building, and I found a handful of what I thought were walnut boards that looked to be perfect. 2 of the boards were rough milled, so I cut them to rough length with the miter saw, and then started squaring up one face of the jointer,
Mahogany.
only to discover that 2 of these boards weren't walnut, but instead were mahogany or sapele. That meant I didn't have enough of one species to make the drawer fronts, so I went back to the drawing board and decided to instead glue up one large maple panel, which I could cut the drawer fronts from. This material was left over from making the custom trim for the not-so-tiny house and was already ripped to around 4 inches wide, so I cut a pile of these strips to rough length and then started milling them by skip planing them at the planer. Because this panel didn't really need to be dead flat since it would be cut up into a bunch of smaller pieces later, skip planing allowed me to mill the boards a little more quickly than having to start at the jointer, and skip planing usually leaves you with slightly thicker boards. After skip planing, I squared one edge at the jointer and then finally ripped the boards to width at the table saw. For this glue up, I decided to try foregoing dominoes or biscuits since I recently acquired these panel clamps, and while these worked great, I really needed more of them to keep the seams on this entire panel nice and flat. I did my best to smack the boards flush with each other as I tightened the clamps, but I still ended up with a few lippy seams. After the glue dried, I scraped off any excess squeeze out, and then, rather than spending half my day sanding, I figured I could just rip the panel in half at the table saw and run each half through the planer. The planer left me with 2 incredibly smooth panels, and before gluing them back together, this time around I did use a few dominoes for alignment. Biscuits or dowels would work in the same way here, but I personally think it can really make your life easier to use something for alignment on a glue up like this. As you can imagine, the glue up went very smoothly, and a few hours later I could remove the clamps and get the panel sanded, smoothing the seam between the 2 panels. Now, plain maple drawer fronts would have certainly looked fine, but I decided to go all out and engrave a geometric pattern in the panel, which I could then fill with epoxy to make the drawer fronts really pop. And I used a 90-degree V-bit, again from Bits and Bits on my CNC, to engrave the pattern. After zeroing the bit, I got the G-code loaded and got the CNC started, and this only took about 45 minutes. Also, in case you're wondering, I just whipped up this design in Illustrator, which only took a few minutes, and then exported the SVG to Vectric Aspire to create the toolpath. Once the CNC finished, I was left with a few fuzzies due to the direction the CNC was cutting, but these were easy to clean up with a scrap block and some sandpaper. Next, I could get prepped for the epoxy pour, and I started by blasting off any residual sawdust. To keep the epoxy from spilling everywhere, I went ahead and added some Tyvek tape around the edges of the panel, and this should have no problem holding the epoxy while it cures. My epoxy of choice on this project was TotalBoat's tabletop epoxy, and as you can probably tell, I've had this particular epoxy kicking around my shop for probably at least 5 years at this point, and the hardener has yellowed in that time, as most hardeners will with that kind of age, but it should still work perfectly fine. Due to it being pretty cold in my shop, the epoxy was coming out like molasses. To remedy this, I set up my heat gun while I mixed, which helped reduce the viscosity of the epoxy, allowing me to mix it more easily and more thoroughly. After mixing for a few minutes, I added the pigment, Battleship Gray in this case, and continued mixing until it was well distributed. Finally, I could get the epoxy poured, and this was pretty simple. I used a spreader to help spread the epoxy evenly in all the grooves, and I purposely cut these a little deeper than I wanted, so I have room to surface the whole panel after the epoxy dries. While the epoxy dried, I could turn my attention to the drawers again and get started organizing them. And there are lots of ways to organize drawers, but I've recently added a few new 3D printers to my shop, and I might have gone a little crazy 3D printing my drawer storage solution. So I stumbled across this storage system called Gridfinity, which is a grid-based system of organization. The grids are a standardized size, and after installing the grids in your drawers, you can move your different storage accessories around easily. That said, because of the grid, the accessories will stay in place when opening and closing the drawers. It's a very clever system, and I've wanted to implement something similar for years, but it was kind of an insurmountable task without a small army of printers. Thankfully, the folks at Bamboo Labs provided me with 2 of their awesome printers to play with, an X1 Carbon and P1S, and the folks at Matter Hackers were awesome enough to send me another X1 Carbon and a bunch of filament. And after spending the last few weeks printing base plates and accessories, I was finally ready to get started with the organization, and I started by laying out the base plates in the drawers just to make sure I had enough. To install the base plates, I started by using a few spacers to center the grids in the drawer. To attach the base plates to the drawer, I first tried some of these small double-sided sticky dots, which seemed to work great. That said, they were a little slow to install since I had to painstakingly peel each one. After installing the base plates, I could start adding the accessories, and in this topmost drawer, I knew I wanted to house my most used screws. I'd been using these hardware storage organizers for this previously, but didn't like how I had to set the entire thing on my workbench each time I wanted to grab a few screws.
There we go. That's what I like to see. Enough weight to close itself.
With this system, I can just open the drawer and grab some screws, or I can remove the entire bin and set it on my workbench, knowing that the rest of the bins won't slide around with the bin removed. Once the first drawer was roughly organized, I continued on with more drawers on this side, adding the base plates with CA glue this time around. And this went a lot faster, but was also messier and more permanent. I organized all my nails in the second drawer, including my pin nails, brad nails, and narrow crown staples. In some of the larger drawers on the right side, I decided to store some of my sandpaper, since I do a lot of sanding at this table. I printed these sandpaper holders, and I can stack these so I can have two versions of the same grit, one regular and one mesh, in the same spot. I also printed some pieces to hold all my Rockler bench cookies, which I also use all the time at this table. Another item I wanted to store in these drawers were all of my assorted dominoes, biscuits, and dowels. And I had been storing my dominoes in a Systainer, but I think these Gridfinity bins make a lot more sense as I can set the whole bin on top of my workbench while I'm working. So fast forward a day or so, and the epoxy was cured enough for me to move forward, and I checked this by planing a small spot with my block plane. And the shavings were hard and brittle, not soft and gummy like they'd be if the epoxy wasn't cured.
Yep, that looks good.
Now, I could have certainly flattened this whole thing with a plane and some sanding, but I already had the CNC file set up, so I just ran a quick operation with a spoil board flattening bit to skim off the excess epoxy and flush up the low spots. And this only took about 10 minutes, and as you can see, the surface finish was pretty awesome right off the CNC. Before getting to sanding, I figured I could break the panel down into two smaller sections for the left and right bank of drawers, and this would just make the panel a little easier to sand. I first cross-cut the panel and then cut off about 1/4 of an inch from each end, removing the rough edges. Once that was done, I got to work sanding, which took a little while. By far, the worst part about working with epoxy is the sanding, because epoxy shows scratches and tool marks much easier than wood. After sanding, it was time to start cutting the two panels into the individual drawer fronts, and this was a little nerve-wracking. After cutting, I also made sure to label the back of each drawer front so I could easily keep track of them. On this bottommost drawer front, I needed to trim off the bottom edge, since it was one of the rough edges from the pour, and I made sure to trim off the same amount from the other bank of drawers as well, to make sure to keep that pattern continuous. Once it was cut to size, I set the drawer front in place, added some 1/8 inch spacers, and then repeated the process for the rest of the drawer fronts on this left side. Thankfully, everything went smoothly, and the left side was looking pretty awesome once all the drawer fronts were in place. I repeated the process for the right side, and I was really excited with how everything was looking. Next up was more sanding, since I needed to sand all those cut edges and break the sharp edges, and thankfully this went pretty quickly, and once that was done, I was ready for finish. I decided to try a new-to-me finish on these drawer fronts, this Wood Honey from Total Boat, and I personally think shop projects like this are a great opportunity to practice new techniques and try new processes. And I'm glad I tried the Wood Honey because it ended up looking great. After letting the finish dry overnight, I could finally get the drawer fronts installed, which was pretty straightforward. First, I temporarily nailed a strip of plywood to the right bank of drawers, which I could butt the left drawer fronts up against during installation. I needed to remove the drawer above to get my clamps in place, and once that was done, I pre-drilled and added a few 1-inch screws from inside the drawer. Also, I could just grab the screws from my new screw drawer, which was so much easier than those hardware organizers. From there, it was just rinse and repeat up the left half of drawers, with the exception of the topmost drawer, where I hot glued the front in place before sliding out the drawer and adding clamps, since I couldn't get the clamps in place otherwise. I somehow didn't start my camera before installing the handles on the left side, but I continued installing the drawer fronts on the right side, My wife also came by to grab something from the shop, and I think she was pretty impressed with my work.
I actually like the color.
It's ridiculous, but
It's like kind of gorgeous. I kind of want you to make us a dresser with that pattern.
Anyway, to install the drawer pulls, I used this jig from Craig, which was pretty simple. I set the height on the jig to roughly center the handle vertically, and then I used a combination square to set the jig's position left to right. I marked the hole locations with a center punch and then pre-drilled the holes before installing the handles. And I got a ton of comments about the pulls I installed on my lift top table and on the van cabinets, saying I'd be catching things on those handles constantly. And while I've yet to actually catch anything on them so far, I figured I could try a different style of handle on this project. With that, the drawer fronts were on and the drawers were a wrap, so now I could turn my attention to the Systainer storage. Before installing the trays, I needed to sand them down as they'd also gotten some mold on them, but had also seen years of overspray and dust buildup. As I mentioned earlier, I had built these trays when I built the assembly table originally, and they've been working great. I just wanted to reconfigure them to get some more efficiency out of the storage now that those Workbench casters were gone.
oh yeah, that looks good.
I did a dry fit on the Systainer locations, and this was really important to maximize my storage. I made sure to leave at least a few inches above the topmost Systainers so they could be opened more easily when slid out, since the top of the assembly table hangs over so much. And as you can see, they work really well. I love how all the accessories for each of these tools is neatly stored in its individual Systainer, and I can just grab it and go if I need to use the tool off-site. I'm also going to store some less used Systainers in that back area, and I'm not sure if I want to build more trays or just store them like this since, again, I don't really use them very often. And I really couldn't be more excited with how this whole assembly table turned out. If you guys enjoyed the video, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy building.